Hello, this is Chef John from foodwishes.com with green lentil gumbo soup. That's right, we're making lentil soup with the same things we put in gumbo, except for the signature component, which is the roux, which is why the word gumbo is in quotations. But thanks to not using that, this delicious soup is dairy-free, gluten-free, and much lower in fat. And to get started, the first thing we'll do is toss some cut up andouille sausage into a dry soup pot set over medium heat. And what we'll do is wait for that to start sizzling, and then we'll cook that stirring for a few minutes, or until it starts to brown. And we're using medium heat because we don't want to go too fast, since before it browns too much, we want some of that flavorful fat to render out. And how much of that we're going to get really depends on the sausage. So after we have browned our sausage, we will observe the bottom of the pot. And if it seems like there's a lot of fat down there, we'll only add a little bit of olive oil for the next step. But as you can see, I did not really get that much fat at all. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and drizzle in a couple tablespoons of olive oil. And that's because the next step is sauteing what we call in the gumbo business, the Holy Trinity, which as you might know is onions, green pepper, and celery. And it's these three aromatic vegetables that form the base of so many great Cajun and Creole recipes. And what we'll do is toss in a big pinch of salt, and then we'll cook all this stirring until those veggies soften and sweeten up, and those pieces of onion go from bright white to sort of translucent. And as I mentioned in the intro, we are not using a roux here, which is flour slowly cooked in fat, usually to a dark brown. And that really is the signature component in gumbo, and how they all start. But we're not doing that here, and we're going to rely on our green lentils to thicken our soup up, which I really do think worked out beautifully. But anyway, we'll go ahead and cook our veggies until they look something like this, at which point we can stop and toss in some spices and herbs, including paprika, some ground cumin, some freshly ground black pepper, as well as some dried thyme, some dried oregano, plus 1 bay leaf. And we'll stir all that together, and we'll cook it for another 2 minutes or so, just to wake up those spices a little bit. Oh, and at this point, if you see some of that goodness sticking and caramelizing on the bottom of the pot, do not be alarmed. That is exactly what we want to have happen. Since that is a lot of concentrated flavor, which is just about to be dissolved by our next ingredient, which would be 6 cups of the best chicken stock or broth that we could make or buy. And I recommend using something low sodium or no sodium, since if we're cooking beans or lentils, if the liquid's too salty, it'll take a lot longer for them to get tender, if they even do, especially if you're using older beans and lentils that have sat around for a while, which is also why we don't want to adjust for salt till the end of the recipe. And at this point, we can raise our heat to high, since we want this to come up to a simmer. And once it does, we can go ahead and add whatever other protein and or vegetables we're going to use, which for me is going to be a couple chicken thighs I cut up into bite-sized pieces, as well as some beautiful smoked ham that I cubed up. And then I also decided to add a little bit of freshly sliced okra, which I don't see that often in the store, but since I did, I grabbed a handful and sliced those up and tossed them in. And as far as adding other ingredients, feel free to get creative here. I mean, you guys are after all the Cajuns of using your imaginations, and this kind of soup is a great catch-all for things you might have in the fridge. Okay, if it's a vegetable or an herb or a protein, it will gumbo. And once that's stirred in, we'll adjust our heat to about medium-low, or whatever maintains a nice gentle but steady simmer. And then I like to cook this for about 10 minutes or so, just to give everything a little head start, before we add the star of the show and roux substitute, 1 cup of green lentils, which I did rinse off first, although just between you and me, I don't always do that, and I've lived to tell the tale. But anyway, we'll go ahead and stir those in. And then basically all we need to do is cook this soup for about an hour or so, or however long it takes for those lentils to get beautifully tender and soft, and for our soup to thicken slightly. And do not under any circumstances go by appearance, since these lentils will swell up fairly quickly, and they will look like they're cooked way before they really are. Okay, the only way to screw this soup up is to undercook the lentils. So let's not do that. So I let mine simmer for just over an hour, stirring occasionally, mostly just for fun. And about an hour later, my soup looked like this, which looked and felt pretty done. But as we just went over, we have to give them a taste to make sure. So I'm going to go ahead and test a spoon of lentils to make sure they're nice and tender. Come on. Here we go. Third time's a charm. And I'm happy to report those were beautifully tender. But if yours are not, just let them cook. But if they are nice and soft, we can move on to the final step, which involves adding a little bit of Worcestershire sauce, plus as much Louisiana hot sauce as you're into. I also like to toss in a very generous amount of freshly chopped Italian parsley, plus a nice big old handful of freshly sliced green onions. And what we'll do is stir all that together and let it cook for another couple minutes, at which point we may be ready to serve up. And if I sound unsure, it's only because we haven't given it a final taste yet, since maybe it needs a little more salt, or maybe we want it a little more spicy, or possibly it seems a little too thick, in which case we could stir in a little more broth. But after tasting and evaluating, I decided it was perfect, so I grabbed a ladle, since my green lentil gumbo was ready to serve up. And after ladling this into a bowl, it is certainly hearty and satisfying enough to eat as is. But since I enjoy my regular gumbo with rice, I decided to add some beautiful steamed jasmine rice in. And yes, I definitely poked those 2 very distracting grains of rice down into the soup, before finishing with some freshly sliced green onions. And then last but never least, a couple shakes of cayenne. I know you were waiting for it. And that's it, what we're calling green lentil gumbo was ready to enjoy. And that, my friends, was some of the best soup I've had in a really long time. Which is saying something, because I just made and had lasagna soup. But since I'm a gumbo fanatic, and I absolutely love all types of lentil soups, this was everything I'd hoped for, and way more. Right, this really did have an extremely gumbo-like flavor profile. Yet because we did not use that roux, and instead used the lentils to thicken the soup, this was significantly lighter and less rich. But having said that, still very, very satisfying and extremely comforting. And by the way, I did make this very meaty, which when it comes to soups is something I tend to do. Or as the old commercial used to say, I like my soup to eat like a meal, but you could certainly dial back the meat content, especially since those lentils provide a good amount of protein. Or instead of chicken and ham, you could do an andouille and shrimp version, or crawfish. All right, there are so many options and combinations that would be great in this, including doing it with no meat. Or I think this would be fantastic with just some caramelized mushrooms, which are never not a great pairing with lentils. But anyway, the point is this recipe is infinitely adaptable, and I predict we will never make it the same way twice. And in case you're wondering, this would work with any kind of lentil, although texturally I do like the green lentils the best, since they tend to retain their shape, and don't completely collapse into a mush, like red lentils will, for example, although some people might prefer that. So I guess, as usual, depends on what you're into. But no matter what you use, or how you adapt this to your tastes, I thought this was phenomenal, which is why I really do hope you give this a try soon. So please follow the links below for the ingredient amounts, a printable written recipe, and much more info as usual. And as always, enjoy.